She stared down at the crumpled pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Positive. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, but now, standing at the threshold, her voice felt trapped in her throat. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Linda was sitting on the couch, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the rim of her coffee cup. She looked up as Emma entered, her face unreadable. "Mom?" Emma's voice came out softer than she intended. I need to talk to you. It's important." Linda exhaled, setting her cup down. "I was just about to say the same thing." Emma hesitated. "Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support." There was something strange in her mother's expression, a quiet apprehension, like she was bracing herself for impact. Emma clenched her fingers around the pregnancy test in her palm. She swallowed hard. "Hi." Her voice cracked. "I'm pregnant." A sharp silence. Linda's eyes widened, but she didn't react the way Emma had expected. There was no shock, no explosion of emotion. Instead, there was something else. A flicker of fear. Emma, stomach twisted. "Mom." Linda exhaled, pressing her lips together. After a long pause, she whispered, "So, am I?" Emma froze for a second. The words didn't make sense. They didn't belong in the same sentence. They felt wrong. A strange ringing filled her ears as she stared at her mother, trying to process what she had just heard. "You?" Emma's voice barely came out. "Are you pregnant?" Linda nodded. Emma's knees threatened to give out. She lowered herself onto the armrest of the couch, gripping the fabric as if it could somehow steady her. The shock crashed over her in waves. She had come here expecting disappointment, maybe even anger. But not this. Not both of them. A creeping dread coiled in her stomach. She forced herself to breathe, to think there was still a chance. This wasn't as bad as it seemed. Trying to keep her voice steady, she asked, "Mom, who's the father?" Linda's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She looked away for a moment, her throat moving as she swallowed. Then softly, she whispered. Harrison weighed up everything inside. Emma went still. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. She didn't even realize she had dropped the pregnancy test until she heard it hit the floor. She stared at her mother. Her breath was shallow, her vision blurring at the edges. No. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the look on Linda's face, a mixture of guilt and devastation, told her otherwise. Emma's hands curled into fists, both of them pregnant with the same man's child. The name Harrison Wade hung in the air like a curse. Emma's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the impossible truth. How could this have happened? How could she and her mother, two completely different women from two different generations, have fallen for the same man? Who was Harrison Wade? Really 50 years old. A self-made millionaire. A man who had clawed his way out of nothingness and built an empire with his bare hands. But money couldn't change everything. Harrison Wade was not the kind of man people call handsome. His broad frame, deep-set eyes, and scarred face made him look more like a man who belonged on a battlefield than a boardroom. People whispered stories about him that he had been beaten as a child, that his face had been disfigured in a fight over money, that he had learned very early. That power was the only thing that made a man untouchable. And so he had built himself into something untouchable. Cold, calculating, unapologetic. Yet for all his roughness, his brutality, there was something about him. Something that drew people in a presence of force. And both Linda and Emma had felt it long before Harrison Wade became a man who commanded respect and fear. He had been just a boy in love with Linda Thompson. They had met when they were both barely 18. Two kids from opposite worlds. Linda had been the golden girl, the one who turned heads when she walked into a room. Soft, warm, untouchable. Harrison had been the outcast, the one with rough hands and eyes, too old for his age. But against all odds, they had fallen in love. Linda had loved his ambition, his intensity, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And Harrison, he had loved her goodness. For the first time in his life, someone had seen him as more than his scars. He had planned a future with her. But Linda's family had other plans. A man like Harrison Wade, poor, angry, a boy with no future would never be enough for a woman like Linda. And so she had done what she was told. She had married someone else. Harrison had watched her walk away, watched her build a life with another man. And he had learned his lesson. Love was for the weak, and he would never be weak again. Linda's marriage had not been a happy one. Her husband had been distant, unfaithful, more in love with his career than with his family. When the divorce papers were signed, Linda found herself alone and somehow, as if fate had been waiting for the right moment, Harrison had come back into her life. It had been so many years. He was no longer the boy with nothing to offer. Now he was a man with more power than she could ever imagine. And this time, he refused to let her slip away. Linda hadn't resisted. It was like stepping back into a fire that had never truly gone out. Emma had never heard any of this. She had never even known Harrison Wade's name until she met him for the first time at a business gala 6 months ago. She had been there on behalf of her marketing firm, dressed in a sleek black gown, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Harrison Wade had been there too, and the moment their eyes met, Emma felt it. That magnetism, that power, that presence. At first, she had found him intimidating, almost unapproachable. But then he had spoken to her, and he wasn't like the men she was used to. He wasn't soft. He didn't flirt mindlessly, didn't throw empty compliments her way. He had looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like he could see right through her. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she had wanted him to. She had fallen for him. And now she realized, so had her mother. As Emma sat there in stunned silence, her mother's voice barely reached her ears. "Emma?" Linda said softly. "I didn't know if I had." Emma's head snapped up. "You didn't know?" "How could I not know?" Linda flinched. "He never told me about you, and you never told me about him." Emma let out a bitter laugh. "So what? We just happened to fall for the same man. We both just happened to end up pregnant with a child." Linda's hands trembled in her lap. "Emma, I loved him a long time ago. And when I saw him again, Emma shot up from the couch, hands shaking. "Stop." She couldn't hear this. She couldn't breathe. This was beyond betrayal, beyond wrong. Her entire world had just shattered into something unrecognizable, and there was no going back. The living room felt too small, too suffocating for the weight of the truth that had just been spoken. Emma's heart was pounding. Her breath comes in short, uneven bursts. She had walked into this room thinking her life was about to change forever, but not like this. She had prepared herself for the shock of telling her mother she was pregnant. She had expected disappointment, maybe even anger, but she had never expected this. She had never expected her mother to be carrying the child of the same man, Harrison Wade. The name felt like poison in her mouth. Linda sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the floor as if looking at her daughter was too much to bear. Emma, on the other hand, could barely contain the storm raging inside her. She clenched her fists. "How long?" Linda finally looked up. Her lips parted slightly. Emma's voice shook with fury. "How long have you been with him?" Linda swallowed. "A little over a year." Emma let out a sharp, bitter laugh. A year she had been with Harrison for 6 months. That meant that while she had been falling for him, believing she was special to him, he had already been with her mother. The realization sent a violent shudder through her. "You knew," Emma whispered. Her voice is barely audible. Linda's brows furrowed. "What?" Emma snapped, her voice rising. "You knew, didn't you? You knew I was with him. And you didn't say anything." Linda's eyes widened with horror. "Emma? No, I swear I didn't know. I would never." Emma shook her head, backing away. "You expect me to believe that?" Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "I'm telling the truth. He never told me about you. I never even suspected." Emma's laughter was cold, hollow. "Of course he didn't tell you, because why would he? Why ruin the game? He was playing with both of us." Linda's face crumpled in pain. But Emma wasn't done. She felt betrayed, humiliated, disgusted. "I told you everything, Mom," she hissed, her voice trembling. "I told you when I started seeing someone. I told you how I felt about him. And you never thought, even once, that maybe you should say something." Linda closed her eyes as if she couldn't bear to hear the words. Emma's hands were shaking. She felt like she was going to be sick. This wasn't just some random man. This was a man her mother had loved, a man she had given her heart to, and now they were both carrying his child. It was too much to process, too much to accept. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife even deeper, the front door swung open. A tall, commanding figure stepped inside, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. Emma's blood turned ice cold. Harrison weighed the. He stood there completely composed, as if he hadn't just walked into a hurricane of devastation. His dark eyes swept across the room, first to Linda, then to Emma, and he didn't look remotely surprised. Emma felt something inside her. Snap! You? She spat. Her voice dripped with venom. Harrison let out a slow exhale, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. I assume you know. Emma let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I know, all right. Linda, still on the couch, buried her face in her hands. Emma took a step forward, her entire body trembling. How long? Harrison, she demanded. How long did you plan on keeping this secret? Harrison's expression remained unreadable. I didn't plan for any of this. Emma's rage exploded. You didn't plan. You were sleeping with a mother and her daughter. And you didn't think that might be a problem? Linda let out a soft sob, her shoulders shaking. Harrison's gaze flickered to her, then back to Emma. His voice was infuriatingly calm. I never meant to hurt either of you. Emma scoffed. Congratulations. Who did anyway? Harrison let out a slow breath, stepping forward. Listen to me. No. Emma snapped, stepping back. You don't get to explain this away. She felt like a fool, a complete, utter fool. Had anything he ever told her been real? The way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. Had it all been a lie? She couldn't breathe. Her world was crumbling, and the man standing in front of her was the reason. And then, just when she thought nothing could make this worse, Harrison spoke again. His voice was calm and assured as if he truly believed what he was about to say. Ten Yukon Coxai Tak Hai Noi Du Quantron Voi Toi. The words hit me like a slap across the face. She stared at him, stunned, disgusted. Linda looked up from her hands, her tear-streaked face filled with agony. Emma's hands curled into fists. You're unbelievable, she whispered. Harrison tilted his head. Emma, I stop. Emma's voice was low. Dangerous. You don't love us. You love power. You love control. And you love knowing that you had both of us without either of us knowing the truth. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. Emma turned to her mother. Linda's face was racked with pain. Emma wanted to hate her. She wanted to throw this pain back at her face. But at the same time, this wasn't just her mother's fault. They had both been played. They had both been broken by the same man. Linda's voice was barely a whisper. What do we do now? Emma didn't have an answer because for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. The silence in the room was suffocating. Emma's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. But beneath it all, there was something even worse, a deep, knowing heartbreak. She had loved Harrison. She had believed she was special to him. Now she felt like a fool. She looked at her mother, the woman who had raised her, who had been her closest confidant. But now Linda felt like a stranger. And then there was Harrison, standing there, so infuriatingly calm, so sure of himself, as if this entire situation could be reasoned away. Emma clenched her fists. She had to get out of there. She turned toward the door. Emma, wait. Linda's voice was pleading, desperate. Emma stopped, but didn't turn around. Her mother's voice shook. I know this is impossible, but we can't just walk away from it. We need to talk. Clock. Emma let out a bitter laugh, still staring at the door. What is there to talk about, Mom? Do you want me to sit down and discuss how we're both carrying the child of the same man? Linda flinched but didn't back down. I know you're angry. Emma finally turned to face her, her eyes blazing. Angry? No, Mom. I'm beyond angry. I feel sick. I feel like I don't even know who you are. Linda's eyes filled with tears. I never meant for this to happen, Emma. Neither did I. Emma snapped. But here we are. Linda took a slow breath. I love him. Emma's chest tightened painfully. Her voice came out hoarse. What? Linda's eyes flickered toward Harrison, then back to Emma. I never stopped loving him, even after all these years. When I saw him again, everything came rushing back. Emma felt sick. Linda continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I know how this looks. I know how much it hurts you, but I can't. I can't pretend my feelings for him don't exist. Emma felt rage bubbling up inside her. So what? You're just going to be with him even now? Even after knowing everything? Linda's lips trembled. I don't know. Emma's breath came out in ragged gasps. Well, I do. She turned to Harrison, her eyes flashing with hatred. Why do you want to know the worst part of all of this? She said, her voice shaking. I loved you. Something flickered in Harrison's eyes. The first real emotion she had seen from him all night. Emma let out a sharp breath, and I thought, God, I was so stupid. I thought you loved me, too. Harrison's voice was steady. I do. Emma laughed bitterly. You don't even know what love is. Harrison exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I never intended to hurt either of you, and I will take responsibility for both of you, for both children. Emma felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Linda looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Do you mean that? Emma snapped her gaze toward her mother. Are you seriously considering this? She asked, her voice full of disbelief. Mom, he's saying he'll take care of us like we're some kind of business investment. Do you really think that's love? Linda's face crumpled. I don't know what else to do. Emma's heart shattered. She had always looked up to her mother. She had always believed Linda was strong, smart, and independent. But now she just saw a woman who didn't know how to let go of the past. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. I can't do this, she whispered. She turned to Harrison. I don't want your money. I don't want your name. And I sure as hell don't want your pity. His expression remained unreadable. So what are you going to do? Emma straightened her spine. I'm leaving. Emma stormed out of the house, her chest burning, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Her whole life had just imploded. She had nowhere to go. No plan, no certainty, just the unbearable weight of knowing she had been betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Her legs carried her down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to think. She needed to decide, Sue. The logical choice was to get rid of the baby. If she did, she could pretend this never happened. She could erase every trace of Harrison Wade from her life. But then, she placed a trembling hand on her stomach. Could she really do that? Tears slipped down her cheeks. She was angry, hurt, humiliated. But was it fair to punish the baby for what had happened? This child was innocent. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand over her heart. No, she couldn't do it. But that left her with two impossible choices. 1. Go back. Forgive her mother. Accept the situation. 2. Leave everything behind and raise the baby on her own. Neither option was easy. But one thing was clear. She would never be a pawn in Harrison Wade's game again. The storm that had begun between Emma, Linda, and Harrison did not stay contained within their small, fractured world for long. By the end of the week, the entire family knew, and the backlash was unforgiving. It started with a single phone call. Emma wasn't sure who had spilled the truth first. Maybe her mother, in a moment of weakness, maybe a distant relative who had overheard too much. But within days, the whispers spread like wildfire. By the time Margaret Thompson, Linda's mother, and Emma's grandmother found out there was no stopping it, the woman arrived at Linda's house like a storm, wrapped in pearls and pressed silk. Her voice cut through the walls before she even stepped inside. What have you done, Linda? Emma flinched at the venom in her grandmother's voice, but she didn't move from her place on the couch. She felt too exhausted to fight. Linda, on the other hand, rose to her feet. Mom, please. Margaret's sharp glare silenced her. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked at Linda like she didn't even recognize her. This is beyond shameful. Margaret spat, her face red with fury. You have disgraced this family in a way I never thought possible. Linda, shoulders tightened. I know how it looks, but it's more complicated than that. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. Oh, is it? Because from where I'm standing, it's horrifyingly simple. Her gaze flickered to Emma, who had remained silent. And you? Margaret whispered, shaking her head. My own granddaughter caught up in this mess. Emma stiffened. She wasn't sure what hurt more, her grandmother's disgust or the look of pure disappointment in her eyes. "I didn't know, Grandma," she said quietly. "I had no idea." Margaret's voice trembled with rage. "And yet here we are, with both of you, carrying a child. Tell me, how does something like this happen?" Neither Linda nor Emma had an answer. Because what could they say? Nothing could justify this. As if the night couldn't get any worse. The front door opened once again. Harrison Wade stepped inside his towering presence, immediately making the already tense room feel smaller. Emma felt her stomach churn. Margaret's eyes narrowed in pure hatred. "You?" she hissed. Harrison met her gaze without hesitation. "Mrs. Thompson, you will not address me," Margaret snapped. The room fell deathly silent. Margaret's voice was sharp as a blade. "I don't know what kind of sick game you think you're playing, Mr. Wade, but you will not ruin my family any further." Harrison exhaled slowly. "I'm not here to play games. I came to take responsibility for both Linda and Emma." Margaret let out a harsh laugh. "Responsibility? You mean like how you took responsibility for my daughter before ruining her life? Or how you strung along my granddaughter while still whispering lies in Linda's ear?" Harrison's jaw tightened. "I care about them," he said, his voice steady. "And I will make sure they do." "You will do nothing," Margaret snapped, stepping closer. "You are not a savior, Mr. Wade. You are a disease." Harrison's face darkened. Emma stayed silent. She wanted to speak, to tell her grandmother that nothing she said would change what had already happened. But a part of her knew that wasn't true, because something was changing and the change was happening inside. Linda. Linda had stood quietly through the entire argument, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. But now she spoke. "Enough," she whispered. Margaret turned to her. "Excuse me." Linda's hands were shaking. "I said enough," she repeated louder this time. "I know what I've done. I know how horrible this looks. But do you think I wanted this? Do you think I woke up one day and decided to ruin my daughter's life?" Emma felt a pang of emotion at her mother's words. Linda turned to Harrison next, and this time there was no lightning in her eyes, just exhaustion. "Harrison, I loved you," she admitted, "and for a while I thought maybe we could go back to what we had." Harrison remained still unreadable. "But look at us," Linda continued, her voice breaking. "Look at what we've done." Harrison's brow furrowed. "We can fix this." Linda let out a sad, tired laugh. "No, we can't." The realization settled over the room like a slow-moving storm. Linda took a deep breath. "I can't lose my daughter over this," she said firmly. Harrison stiffened. "Linda," she shook her head. "I love you, but I love Emma more." Emma's breath caught. Her mother turned to face her. "I'm so sorry," Linda whispered. "I should have never let it get this far." Emma felt something break inside her. She had been waiting for these words, for her mother to finally choose her. And now she had. Harrison let out a slow, measured breath. "So that's it." Linda gave him a sad final nod. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it." A heavy silence filled the room. Harrison looked at both of them one last time, to women who had loved him and who had now chosen to walk away. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Margaret exhaled, her posture finally relaxing. Linda sat down on the couch, her shoulders shaking. But this time the tears that fell weren't just from heartbreak. They were from relief. Emma took a hesitant step forward. She wasn't sure if things between her and her mother would ever be the same. But as she reached out and placed a hand over Linda's, she knew one thing for sure: they would figure it out together. Harrison Wade was not a man who begged. For years, he had built his empire on power, control, and absolute certainty. He had never needed to chase after anyone. People always came to him. But tonight, standing in Linda's dimly lit living room, he was chasing a woman who had finally made up her mind. "Linda, you don't have to do this," Harrison said. His deep voice was low and controlled, but with an edge of something unfamiliar. Desperation. Linda stood with her arms crossed over her stomach. Her eyes are red-rimmed, but firm. "Yes, I do," she said quietly. Harrison took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. She didn't move away, but she didn't soften either. "I could take care of you," he said, his tone measured. "Of both of you." Linda let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Do you still think this is about money?" Harrison's jaw clenched. No, it's about what we had, what we still have. Linda shook her head. Harrison, we don't have anything. Not anymore. He stilled. You loved me once, he reminded her. Linda exhaled shakily. And that was my biggest mistake. Harrison flinched for the first time, his carefully built mask cracked just slightly. Linda's voice softened. I don't mean it the way it sounds. I did love you, but I let that love blind me to what was right in front of me, to the people I was hurting. Harrison's hands curled into fists at his sides. I never meant to hurt either of you. Linda nodded. I know, but that doesn't change the fact that you did. Harrison's throat bobbed for the first time. He looked lost. He had fought battles in boardrooms, taking down powerful men without blinking, and survived things that would have broken lesser men. But he couldn't win this, and he knew it. Linda took a small step back, putting the final distance between them. This is goodbye, Harrison. Harrison didn't speak because for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small framed photo on her nightstand. It was a picture from her childhood. Her maybe 7 years old, grinning up at her mother as Linda held her close. They had been so happy back then before life had gotten complicated, before she had known that even mothers could make terrible mistakes. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She already knew who it was. Emma swallowed and took a breath. Come in. Linda stepped inside hesitantly, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Linda's face crumbled. Tears spilled over her cheeks as she whispered, I'm so sorry, Emma. Emma felt her throat tighten. Her mother's hands were shaking. She wiped at her tears, but they kept coming. I never meant to hurt you. Linda choked out. I should have seen it. I should have known how wrong this was. I should have been your mother first, not some foolish woman clinging to the past. Emma's vision blurred. She had spent so much time being angry, feeling betrayed, wanting to hate her mother for what she had done. But standing here now, watching her mother break in front of her, she couldn't hate her because for the first time, she understood. Linda hadn't just been the villain in the story. She had been a victim of a love that had held her captive for far too long. Emma let out a shaky breath. Then finally she stood up, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around her mother. Linda let out a broken sob and clung to her daughter like she was afraid to let go. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, Emma held her back. 1 year later, the small house was nothing like the grand estates Harrison Wade had once promised them. No marble floors, no towering chandeliers, no sprawling acres of land. But it was warm. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Emma sat on the couch, gently rocking the small bundle in her arms. Her daughter, Lillian, tiny, perfect with soft curls and the brightest eyes Emma had ever seen. Across from her, Linda cradled her own son, Noah. He was just as small, just as innocent, just as unaware of the complicated world he had been born into. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, the quiet hum of life surrounding them. Then Linda let out a small, bittersweet chuckle. If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here like this, I would have laughed in their face. Emma smiled softly, looking down at her daughter. Yeah, me too. Linda sighed, adjusting Noah in her arms. Do you ever think about him? Emma knew who she meant. Harrison Wade. But the man who had once held both their hearts in his hands. The man who had, in the end, lost them both. She had heard whispers about how his business had suffered, how he had withdrawn from the public eye. He still had his millions, his power, but he had lost the only thing that had ever made any of it mean something. I don't know, Emma admitted. Maybe. Linda nodded as if that answer was enough. Then she looked at her daughter, at her grandson, and smiled. Because in the end, Harrison's way didn't matter. His money didn't matter. His power didn't matter. This moment, this family, this love, this was all that mattered. Emma and Linda had hurt each other. They had broken each other. But somehow they had put each other back together again. And now they had 2 little lives depending on them. 2 innocent children who would never know the weight of their complicated past. Only love. Only family. Emma took a deep breath, then reached over and placed her free hand over her mother's. Linda squeezed it. No word were needed. They understood. Then, with their babies in their arms, the two women stood, and together they walked out the front door, stepping into a new future. One without ghosts, without regrets. Just a mother, a daughter, and a life they chose to build. And so, against all odds, through heartbreak and betrayal, Linda and Emma found their way back to each other. They had been broken, but they had healed. Not because of man, not because of wealth, but because of love. The love between a mother and her daughter. The love that endured even when everything else fell apart. This story reminds us that family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stand by each other, no matter how difficult the road may be. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to soul-stirring stories for more emotional, powerful, and unforgettable tales. Because sometimes the most complicated stories lead to the most beautiful endings.